Welcome to the AskJunior Daily Judgment podcast. I'm Priya Mehta, and joining me today is Arjun Sharma.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's landmark judgment about accessibility rights for persons with disabilities. But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our podcast if you enjoy our daily legal breakdowns.
That's right. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue providing in-depth analysis of the latest court decisions. Today, we're discussing a fascinating and crucial judgment from the Supreme Court in Rajive Raturi v. Union of India, which addresses the fundamental right to accessibility for persons with disabilities.
This case is particularly significant because it tackles systemic issues in how we approach accessibility in India. The judgment was delivered by Chief Justice Dr. D.Y. Chandrachud just today, and it's a comprehensive examination of accessibility rights that could reshape how we think about public spaces and services.
Let's start with some background. This case actually began way back in 2005 when Rajive Raturi, who is visually challenged and works with a human rights organization, filed a petition seeking directions to ensure safety and accessibility in public spaces for visually challenged persons.
It's interesting to note that when the petition was initially filed, it was under the old Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995. Since then, we've moved to the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016, which is a much more comprehensive piece of legislation.
Exactly. In 2017, the Supreme Court had already issued a judgment with 11 action points for compliance. However, progress was slow, and that's what led to this current judgment. The court had appointed NALSR's Center for Disability Studies to assess the situation on the ground.
Before we dive into the specifics of the judgment, Priya, I think it's important to explain what we mean by accessibility in this context. The court provides a very clear definition. It's about ensuring that products, services, environments, and systems can be accessed, used, and benefited from by all individuals, including those with disabilities.
That's right, Arjun. And the court emphasizes that this isn't just about physical access like ramps or elevators. It includes access to information, communication, and digital platforms. The judgment really drives home the point that inaccessibility leads to exclusion from education, employment, healthcare, and public services.
One of the most interesting aspects of this judgment is how it frames accessibility as a human right. The court draws from international frameworks, particularly the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to establish that accessibility isn't just a convenience, it's a fundamental right.
Let's talk about what the court calls the social model of disability. This is a crucial shift in how we think about disability. Instead of viewing disability as a medical condition that needs to be fixed, this model focuses on how society creates barriers that disable people.
That's a fascinating point. Could you give our listeners an example to illustrate this difference?
Of course. Think about a person who uses a wheelchair. Under the medical model, the focus would be on their inability to walk. But under the social model, the focus is on how society creates barriers, like buildings without ramps or elevators, that prevent them from accessing spaces. The problem isn't the person's condition, it's the environment that isn't designed to accommodate everyone.
That's a great explanation. The court also introduces what it calls a two-pronged approach to accessibility. Could you break that down for our listeners?
Absolutely. The first prong focuses on making existing infrastructure and institutions accessible. This often involves retrofitting buildings, modifying services, etc. The second prong is about transforming how we design new infrastructure, ensuring accessibility is built in from the start rather than added as an afterthought.
And this is where the court found a significant problem with the current legal framework. The NALSAR report identified an inconsistency between the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act and its rules.
Yes, this is actually the crux of the judgment. The Act creates a mechanism for mandatory compliance with accessibility rules, but Rule 15 of the RPWD rules essentially turned these into self-regulatory guidelines. The court found this problematic.
Let's break this down for our listeners. The Act says that buildings must comply with accessibility rules to get construction permits or completion certificates. It even prescribes fines for non-compliance. but the rules basically turned these requirements into suggestions.
Exactly. The court examined various guidelines prescribed under Rule 15 and found they use language like recommend, may, and it is desirable instead of making clear mandatory requirements. This made enforcement practically impossible.
The judgment includes some striking examples. For instance, different guidelines prescribe different requirements for accessible toilets. How can you enforce a rule when different guidelines conflict with each other?
This brings us to the court's decision. In a significant move, it declared Rule 15.1 ultra vires, or beyond the powers of, the RPWD Act. The court has given the union government 3 months to delineate mandatory rules.
Could you explain what this means in practical terms for our listeners?
Sure. The court is saying that while having detailed guidelines is good, there must also be a clear set of non-negotiable minimum requirements. You can't just have aspirational goals. There needs to be a baseline that everyone must follow.
The court has also laid down some key principles that should be considered while making these rules. These include universal design, comprehensive inclusion across disabilities, integration of assistive technology, and ongoing stakeholder consultation.
I think it's worth noting that the court showed particular appreciation for NALSARCDS's work. They prepared an extensive report over 6 months, consulting 52 experts and receiving reports from 14 states and 3 union territories. The court has directed the government to pay them 50 lakhs as compensation.
This judgment really seems to be a watershed moment for disability rights in India. It's not just about physical accessibility. It covers everything from digital access to transportation, education, and even sports facilities.
Yes, and what's particularly noteworthy is how the court grounds accessibility in fundamental rights under Articles 14, 19, and 21 of the Constitution. It's not just about convenience. It's about equality, freedom of movement, and the right to live with dignity.
The court has set a deadline of March 7th, 2025, for the government to report compliance. This will be interesting to follow up on.
Absolutely. This judgment could lead to significant changes in how we design and build public spaces, how we provide services, and ultimately how we think about inclusion in our society.
Before we wrap up, what do you think are the most immediate implications of this judgment?
I think the most immediate impact will be on new construction projects. Since the court has emphasized that the Act's requirements are mandatory, we might see stricter enforcement of accessibility standards in building permits and completion certificates. The bigger challenge will be retrofitting existing infrastructure within the prescribed timelines.
And that brings us to the end of today's analysis. We hope our listeners found this discussion informative and engaging.
Before we sign off, we'd like to remind our listeners once again to like, subscribe, and share our podcast. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you daily updates on the most important legal decisions.
Absolutely. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow for another exciting episode where we'll be discussing some fascinating judgments from the Supreme Court. Until then, this is Arjun.
And Priya, signing off. Thanks for listening to the AskJunior Daily Judgment podcast.